I'm going to take it off when I speak.
Yes.
Okay. Can I do it now?
Could you do it now? Because people are coming to me.
You want me to stand here? So it's not.
I think you can stay. 出演必要な方は手を挙げてあげてください。すみません、こちらお願いします。
Okay.
この辺で、まだ写真撮り終わった方、お戻りになってください。この辺でよろしいでしょうか。
Okay. Good afternoon again, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for being again with us. This is the third row of the day. This morning we had the Ukrainian ambassador, and then in the afternoon the ambassador of Russia, and now we have the American, U.S. ambassador. Thank you very much, Ambassador, for joining us. Don't think we need to introduce him. He just arrived in Japan after being for many, many years mayor of Chicago. That's where we met the first time, actually, for a very important international event. And then now he's the ambassador of the United States in Japan. He's going, of course, to speak about the crisis in Europe, the Ukraine issue. And we are all ready to listen to his speech, and then we will start, as usually, with Q&A from the floor. May I recommend you, please, again, to check your phones, put it in silent mode, or turn it off. So, thank you very much, and Ambassador, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I want to also thank the association for providing me this opportunity. And also I'd like to thank the ambassador of Ukraine that's also here for his respect. Thank you. Good afternoon. As many of you know, I was scheduled to be in Hiroshima this weekend with the Prime Minister of Japan. Together as friends and as allies, we were planning to lay wreaths in remembrance and in recognition of the horrors of war. Instead of standing together on sacred ground that memorializes the consequences of the nuclear legacy of Hiroshima, instead of standing together to build a future of peace and prosperity, the world is staring once again at the horror of war. President Putin has threatened the world when he said, Russia, and I quote, remains one of the most powerful nuclear states, with a certain advantage in several cutting-edge weapons. He went on, there should be no doubt that any potential aggressor will face defeat and ominous consequences should it directly attack our country. This was a clear threat to deploy nuclear weapons in defense of an indefensible act of war. Over the past 36 hours, the world has watched the unprovoked, unsubstantiated, and unforgivable Russian invasion of Ukraine. This is the second time a Russian leader has subjected the Ukrainian people to gross abuses. The first was forced starvation under Stalin, and now forced subjugation under Putin. Let me be clear. Despite what the Kremlin says, there's no justification for this invasion. There was no provocation from Ukraine. No amount of historical misinterpretation or outright disinformation can justify Russian actions. These are criminal acts that violate international law, Ukraine's integrity, Ukraine's territorial sovereignty, and basic human dignity. On 2 occasions in the past 30 years, the Russian government has made legal commitments through which it swore a peaceful path towards Ukraine. In the 1994 Budapest Accords, Russia committed to respect the independence and sovereignty and existing borders of Ukraine, and to refrain from the threat of or use of force against Ukraine. In exchange for these security guarantees, Ukraine gave up its Soviet-era nuclear weapons for Russia's protection and reassurance. Russia's violation of the Budapest Accords can be described as nothing short of betrayal, exposing President Putin for the duplicitous, deceptive, and disingenuous actor that he is. Russia's unprovoked invasion also is a direct violation of the Minsk agreements signed in 2014 and 2015. These agreements, signed by both Russia and Ukraine, as well as the OSCE, required among their provisions the withdrawal of illegal armed groups, all foreign armed formations, and military equipment from the territory of Ukraine. Ukraine's president repeatedly made clear Ukraine's firm commitment to the agreements and his readiness to contribute constructively to the Minsk process. His pursuit of diplomacy and the preservation of the principles that underpin the rules-based order was instead met by President Putin's march to war. The lesson is clear. President Putin's commitment to the international agreements are worth no more than the paper they are written on. To allow such flagrant disregard and behavior would lead not only to chaos, but also challenge the basic tenets that uphold global security and the international system of order. In the lead up to the invasion and even today, President Putin has offered a litany of pretenses in an attempt to justify military action. In short, his determination for military action is in search of a justification. He claims Ukraine is a security threat to Russia after the occupation of Crimea in 2014, and after amassing more than 100,000 troops on the Ukrainian border. I ask, who is the provocateur? He claims to be defending ethnic Russians in Ukraine, but there are no credible independent reports of any ethnic Russians or Russian speakers being under threat from the Ukrainian government. There are credible reports, however, that native Ukrainians face suppression of their culture and national identity and live in an environment of severe repression and fear. He claims NATO is plotted against Russia. But I think we all know NATO is a defensive, not offensive alliance whose purpose is to protect its member states. Consistent with this, in the expansion of NATO, there were careful and conscious decisions made upon entry of Poland, Romania, the Baltic states, Slovakia, and Slovenia to have no offensive weapons in their territory. He claims Ukraine is not a country. Which of the countries that your papers are from does not have an ambassador of Ukraine? What nation's ambassador who is here with us just spoke here at 11 a.m. and is introduced as Ukraine's ambassador? Who is at the United Nations voting then on behalf of the United Nations, of the Ukraine, if it is not a nation? And the claims only get more outlandish in search of a justification. If you're looking for a definition that defies logic, President Putin claims Ukraine is led by Nazis when its president is a Jew. So what is Putin's motivation? Why would President Putin order an invasion of Ukraine, a neighboring country with which Russia has an affinity in both faith and culture? President Putin is afraid of the future, something far more profound and powerful than military force. The success of a system right on Russia's back door that ensures and upholds individual sovereignty, individual rights, and individual freedoms as sacrosanct. President Putin is frightened by freedom and the march by people towards freedom, whether that's in the 21st century from Kiev to Minsk to Aleppo to Tbilisi, or in the 20th century in Gdansk, Budapest, Prague, or East Berlin. What they have in common are dictators who have been frightened by the march towards freedom. He is scared of Ukraine's success as it is a mirror up to Russia's failures. And most importantly, he's afraid of Ukraine's success for all to see and witness, in contrast to the Russian system. The system President Putin has fought hard to entrench through disinformation and proxies overseas and by crushing internal dissent at home does not work. And the clear sign is that is no one is marching to join it or be a part of it. Look at what the people of Ukraine and Belarus have said about the system and values and principles they want for their future. The people of Ukraine and Belarus, like the people of Hong Kong, are not going to the streets to demand authoritarianism or the exercise of raw power. Russia's neighbors are voting with their feet and their aspirations and for a future. And the appeal of Western ideas, values, and success, economically or politically, is what really frightens President Putin. The world cannot, and it is not, standing for this invasion. All of the G7 countries, including Japan, and the countries of Europe have spoken with one voice, as well as other allies and partners in the Indo-Pacific, including Australia, South Korea, and New Zealand. I welcome and deeply appreciate the Prime Minister Kishida's strong and steady leadership to announce sanctions on Russia in defense of liberty, democracy, human dignity, and international law. Japan's swift response in collaboration with the United States and other G7 members, the European Union, and Australia to implement financial sanctions against the Russian banks, the oligarchs, and entities, suspend visa issuance, and restrict the exports of semiconductors and high-tech products will impose unprecedented economic costs on Russia, and they are welcomed by the United States. Make no mistake, Russia's acts of war have sparked global condemnation and criticism, both from national leaders around the world, as well as peace-loving citizens who have taken to the streets to march in solidarity with Ukraine and show their respect for the national sovereignty and individual freedoms. In fact, even in Russia, people are taking to the streets to protest Putin's decisions. According to civil society reports, President Putin has arrested more than 2,000 of his own citizens in more than 50 cities for taking part in anti-war demonstrations. That's what vengeful and fearful strongmen do when they feel weak. It's a playbook as old as the play. In today's world, it's not easy to cobble together a coalition. It's hard to identify absolute rights and absolute wrongs. I did read with interest the remarks from the Kenyan ambassador to the United Nations, Martin Kimani, to the Security Council. Ambassador Kimani justly called out and criticized President Putin's decision to reject diplomacy and dialogue in favor for the use of force. But beyond criticizing the invasion itself, Ambassador Kimani made a more profound observation about two types of countries and two types of principles in the world. Those who look forward to a brighter future and those who look backward with a dangerous nostalgia. He told Security Council members, African countries agreed that we would settle for the borders that we inherited, but we would still pursue continental, political, economic, and legal integration rather than form nations that looked ever backwards into a history with a dangerous nostalgia. We chose to look forward to a greatness none of our many nations and peoples had ever known. We chose to follow the rules, not because our borders satisfied us, but because we wanted something greater, forged in peace. And that was said not by an ambassador from Europe, but an ambassador to a developing country in Africa who understands the consequences of a decision in Ukraine because the consequences do not stop at Ukraine's borders. This captures, in my view, exactly the motivation behind President Putin's unprovoked attack. A leader looking back with a dangerous nostalgia while the people and nations around him sought something greater forged in peace, a shared future. When you look at his friends, the countries of Syria, Kazakhstan, and North Korea, they are all failed states that are failing their people. President Putin has threatened the world with the use of nuclear weapons, which has particular resonance here in Japan, as you have experienced the horror of nuclear weapons. We cannot and will not let this aggression stand unanswered. The United States and Japan stand with Ukraine and its people, with our allies and partners, and with the people of the world who look forward. Together, we will push back Russia's exercise of raw power and abject disregard for the shared values and shared principles that enable peace and prosperity. In 1962, 60 years ago this year, two world leaders came close to a nuclear war. They had good sense and cleared our view of their future, and most importantly, their responsibility to that future, to pull back, de-escalate in the Cuban Missile Crisis. At every stage in the last 3 months, world leaders have offered President Putin a chance to step back from the brink of war. He has refused. He has rejected their offers. He could have borrowed the wisdom of that great generation of leaders, but he rejected it. Instead of Putin the Great, he has every day increasingly become Putin the pariah. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. Okay, we start now the question and answer. Okay, first, please go to the microphone and state your name and affiliation if you have one. Without the mask is okay, as you wish.
Ambassador Emanuel, thank you so much for coming. I'm Rupert Wingfield-Hayes from the BBC in Tokyo. You just mentioned there that you said President Putin is becoming a pariah. Do you think that does the US government believe that this war now fits the description of a war of aggression? And if so, does the US government, would you then describe President Putin now as a potential war criminal for what he's done? Thank you.
Well, that's obviously a question for legal scholars, not for the ambassador of Japan, and it's one that will have definition. But I think it's obvious to all those who have watched and seen that, and as I said in my remarks, there are two agreements in which Russia has been a signatory to, both Budapest and Minsk, and he's in direct violation of that. And this is a war of aggression. I say that not in just, I mean, there's other people, I'm not a lawyer, so let me say that. So there are legal terms that I don't want to be cavalier about and I want to be careful about. That I'll leave to the lawyers and those that are scholars about it and understand the consequences. But I think it's full right to understand, and the reason I thought it was important to speak today, because you have a violation of something that does not, what happened in Ukraine will not stay in Ukraine. That is why both the Kenyan ambassador to the United Nations spoken, people across the globe that don't border just Russia and Ukraine have spoken up in clarity.
Greg?
Mr. Ambassador, thank you for coming.
Can you give me your...
My name is Gregory Clark. I'm freelance for an Australian publication. I have one question. We've just had the Russian ambassador, and he repeated one of the major reasons or excuses given for the Russian invasion of Ukraine, namely the need for denazification. Now, you will know that there was a resolution in the United Nations calling for rejection of Nazism. And there are only two countries which oppose that resolution. One of them, of course, was Ukraine, where apparently there is a problem of Nazism. The other one was the United States. In retrospect, now that it's being used so forcefully by Russia as one of the excuses for the attack on Ukraine. In retrospect, do you think the United States vote on that resolution was correct or maybe a mistake?
Okay.
Well, Gregory, I think, first of all, I don't have in front of me when that was or what the United Nations U.S. representative said. But I can't answer that. As I said in my remarks, the twist of irony here in this moment is that with a Jewish president of Ukraine, to use denazification as a justification is an example, in my view, a glaring example of the upside-down logic of the decisions that were made here.
Tim Kelly from Reuters. Sorry, I just want to get a bit off topic here. During your Senate confirmation hearing, Senator Haggerty, also the former ambassador here, asked you about Greg Kelly. And you, at that time, you vowed to treat him as though he was a constituent and you were a congressman. His trial, the verdict in his trial is coming next week on Thursday. Do you think he's been treated fairly by the Japanese legal system? And if he faces a prison sentence, if he's convicted and is sent to prison, what will you do? What will your reaction be to that? What will you do to help him? And if I could just add one question onto the end, which is on topic, do you think Russia's invasion of the Ukraine makes a move by China against Taiwan more likely?
Look, I think, Tim, let me take the second question first. Or as President Clinton used to say, I'd like to take your second question first and your first question second, all with the hope that you would forget the first question.
We won't.
No. Don't worry, I didn't need reminding. But I'll take your first question. Look, one of the first things I did when I was in quarantine was call Mr. Kelly, had a conversation with he and his wife. There's nothing I think you could see about me that is shy or reserved or drawback. I have spoken about the importance of this case. I'm not going to speak about the merits or what I think is right, wrong, etc. But when I did speak of the Senate confirmation to Senator Haggerty, it is because, as I said, if memory is serving me well, Mr. Kelly is from Tennessee, so he is a constituent of Senator Haggerty. And also that's something important because the events happened while Senator Haggerty was an ambassador. I was referring to the fact that as a congressman, I knew how it felt when a constituent was being adversely affected in a foreign government or a foreign country. I think that's exactly how I stated it. I'm doing this by memory. You may have something different. So I understood why the senator felt that way. All that being said, I'm now here as a representative of the United States, and Mr. Kelly is a citizen of the United States, and this comes with the obligation as ambassador to the United States to advocate on his behalf. Given the decisions coming up, and there's a lot of attention to it, I don't want to say anything that would adversely affect any chances that he and his family can be reunited with his grandchildren. To your second question, I think it should be noted why the countries in the Indo-Pacific, led by Japan, but including Australia, New Zealand, South Korea, have spoken up. Because whether it's in Europe or here in the Indo-Pacific, there are basic tenets and principles that uphold the system. And those are either violated or agreed to. And since then, you noticed both the UK and France have also indicated their abilities and willingness and desire, and then have acted on that to also make sure that the Indo-Pacific, the Taiwan Straits, stay free and open. This is not just going to be confined between Russia and Ukraine. The reason the ambassador to Kenya has spoken, and others have spoken, and also taken action, because they understand how much danger there is to a violation of an international system here. And Europe realizes that what happens in Europe doesn't stay in Europe, and the countries of the Indo-Pacific understand what happens in Europe doesn't stay there.
Let me jump on online questions. There are several questions. I'll just use one because they're basically the same. And this is from Eric Johnston of the Japan Times.
Okay.
There is a concern in Japan about what Russia actions mean for Russia-Japan economic cooperation and negotiations over the northern territories. And Kishida today has avoided, Prime Minister Kishida, today has avoided questions on what the impact of Russia action on negotiation over the territories may be. He gave a press conference this morning. Is the US concerned that while Japan has announced it will strengthen sanctions against Russia, the government might be slow to implement them in practice due to a desire within influential elements of the ruling coalition who still hope to do a deal with Putin over the return of the northern territories?
Mm-hmm. Well, I have said it before, I've said it here, and just recently I'll repeat it. I can say this firsthand. The United States government, and specifically President Biden and President Biden's administration, could not be happier with both the swiftness and certainty of the Japanese government, and specifically the Prime Minister's actions, the sanctions, the scope, the scale, and the swiftness of those sanctions. And Japan has been in a process going back to World War II in trying to recoup the Northern Islands. Stalin took it then. My comments and my views of that I have been clear about. There's a pattern in practice when it comes to how Russia treats other countries and their territorial integrity. But as it relates to how Japan has acted, I suppose any connotation that there was a sense that we thought that Japan was, I don't know who would say that, because I can state, as I said earlier, there's been a great deal of appreciation in which Japan has acted in lockstep with the G7, been a leader in the G7, and has been swift and certain in the magnitude of the scope and scale of their sanctions.
Another question from the floor. We'll switch from online, and the gentleman there. Oh, I didn't see you. Sorry, Peter. Sorry if I ask you, gentlemen.
That is a mistake, yes, thank you. It's Peter Langen at the South China Morning Post.
Your name again?
Peter Langen.
Okay.
Yeah. I'd like to stay on topic, but if perhaps we can zoom out a little bit here. Next week is the 50-year anniversary of when President Nixon arrived in China, and so became the week that changed the world in terms of establishing the relations between the two countries. And we now seem to be in a week again that may very well change the world. But I'd like to sort of ask your thoughts on the birth of Nixon's policies with China came along with the idea of realpolitik, identifying practical goals and targets and working towards achieving them and putting aside ideological differences. I'm sorry for the history lesson here, but I'm sure you know what I mean.
It's okay. I got a B in history at
Come
Lawrence,
to the
so that's
question.
okay.
Yeah, I'm
Peter.
sorry. So the point is are we at the end of the road for realpolitik, in that we're back again with an ideological confrontation between these two autocratic nations, including, of course, China and Russia? And any thoughts you have on that? Thank you.
So, Peter, I want to make sure I got the question right, or at least the history lesson. If I'm going to get an A, I'd like to make sure I got the history lesson right. The question is, are we walking away from realpolitik towards, again, a confrontation of two systems? Is that what you said? Do I have the question right?
Well,
It doesn't change my answer.
yeah.
Or as Kissinger once said, does anybody have any questions for my answers?
Well, it seems to me that realpolitik may have run its course. We're back at this same ideological
I
confrontation
see.
between
Okay. Well, first of all,
autocracy and democracy. Thank you.
I don't, first of all, I don't think, this is just my view, as a student also of history, the notion that one moment underpins one period and the other one goes by the side. Actually, I think the two of them operate simultaneously in every moment. So I kind of reject the assumption behind the question. That said, I do think you have a period of time where that was somewhat defined by democracy versus democratic capitalism versus authoritarian communism. I think you now have one that is authoritarianism versus democracy. One that is guided by the principle of force, aggression, and coercion versus another one of rule of law, international order, and peaceful resolution. And I think you have many examples of that as recently as from Hong Kong to Kiev, from Belarus and Minsk to Aleppo in Syria. People are not marching on behalf of or towards authoritarianism. People across the globe, with all the faults, and there are many, but they still are desirous of something else, which is the freedoms that we all in this room take for granted. And I look at the systems, and the reason the world has reacted, not limited by boundary or geography, is because of how much is at risk if an authoritarian system where spheres of influence are ruled by coercion, aggression, and force are the determining North Stars. And I also would underpin one other thing. And I think this is really valuable and often and frequently forgotten. Whatever the weaknesses or challenges that exist, the United States, with its allies in Europe, NATO, its allies here in the Indo-Pacific, have allies and friends and coalitions that have a shared sense of a shared future that is worthy of collective action. Neither China or Russia have allies, friends, or coalitions. And there's a reason for that. It's not an accident. Now, if you want to say Belarus is an ally, tell me why the youth and the educated youth are fleeing. If you want to tell me that Syria and Assad is an ally, tell me why thousands of citizens have died from chemical weapons. If you want to tell me why Hong Kong and the people of Hong Kong are not only fleeing on boats, but companies that used to be the shining example of Hong Kong, as recently as the Bank of America yesterday, are leaving. Nobody is flocking towards a system, an authoritarian political system that is based on the principle of raw exercise of power. Democratic governments have their challenges, they have their vulnerabilities, but people across the world of shared experience who are not part of it want to join it, and people that are part of it are willing to fight to keep it. And I don't think it should be lost that the United States, whether it's in the Pacific area or the Atlantic, have friends, allies, partners who willingly want to be a part of it or join it. And that is different than both for Russia and China. And to obscure it would be to lose not when you say the raw exercise of realpolitik or ideological battle. It's the one in which friends and allies come together under a common understanding where others are subjugated to the force of an individual.
Thank you, Ambassador. Talking about the Indo-Pacific, there is a question from the New York Times, Motoko Rich. You mentioned that other Indo-Pacific nations have quickly joined the imposed sanctions, including Japan, Australia, New Zealand, South Korea. So far, India has not. Do you think that the Quad infrastructure will help draw India to join the alliance against Russia in its invasion of Ukraine?
I think it's a good question, as the others have been good questions, but I do think both Russia's actions and I think China's actions on India's border will also strengthen India's commitment to the Quad. Because, again, what happens in Ukraine does not stay in Ukraine. And everybody in the Indo-Pacific understands the consequences if this becomes the norm and accepted behavior of a powerful country.
Questions from the floor? Jimbo, dozo.
Thank you, Ambassador. My name is Teddy Jimbo. I also
Ted?
co-chair the committee that organized the press event at this club with PO. But anyway,
My Japanese brother.
Yeah, the better half.
since you in the Senate confirmation hearing last October, which Tim mentioned earlier, you said that this Mr. Greg Kelly's case is a top priority. So I need to ask you this question. I think saying something about the content of the trial is another, to influence the outcome is should be avoided, and I understand that. But saying something about the treatment of the suspect or convict is another. As you know, Japan's Spartan criminal justice system came under attack when Mr. Kelly and Mr. Gon was arrested. And it actually did receive a number of recommendations from United Nations Torture Committee. So Japan's criminal justice system is seen as a torture by some Western standards. Are you concerned that American citizen is subjected to such a criminal system, regardless of what the outcome may be? And if not, what do you mean by you making a top priority if that's not your concern? Thank you. Just one last thing about the sanction. Very quickly. Sanction works effectively, or only works if it is imposed, say, unanimously in the United Front. In 2014, when Russian took over this Crimea, the Prime Minister Abe was kind of in discussion with President Putin on the disputed island issue, and Japan was not as forthcoming, or Japan was not really par with its allies, United States and others. Now, do you want to see Japan to go along with the rest of Western allies on the sanctions, or Japan should consider its own sanctions? So two questions, whichever you want to answer first, please.
Yeah. Well, look, I don't know if I can be. Let me just say this to the first question. I'm not going to answer it at length because I have spoken to this already earlier. There's not more for me to shed on it. And I let you know that I've had a call with Mr. Kelly and his wife. And beyond me, the embassy has been in touch. And I'm not going to say much more as the case is in the middle of the process. That's wrong. But afterwards, obviously, I'll speak about it. It would be an indication wrong. To the sanction part, I'm ambassador now. You all will decide how to evaluate today how Japan's acting versus 2014. I wasn't here, but I can speak. I know with certainty I can speak that the administration, President Biden specifically, is appreciative of this swiftness of the sanctions, and the comprehensive nature of Japan's sanctions. I do want to note one thing you said, and I take it, and if I could, the question in a slightly different way. After 2014 and the sanctions, Russia's economy's GDP has shrunk by a full third. While they may not be affected today or tomorrow, these sanctions that the President Biden has led the effort on and that have international scope are much more severe, much more, their scope of the countries, not only are they more severe, but they're in greater magnitude. And I think that already the international investment community, given that the stock market in Russia has dropped by 50%, that's 50, not 15, 50. The ruble has lost north of 20% of its value. The sanctions are not only being felt today, they will be felt tomorrow. And the greater strain will not only be the sanctions, but a shrinking economy that has to prop up failed states that are failing their people, from Syria to Belarus to Kazakhstan, and you can go down the list, would only tell you that the strain on the Russian people will have a severe cost. So they're not about just 1 day or 2 day, and that those who try to help Russia evade the sanctions, as President Biden said earlier today, they will be stained by association. Yes, they're more effective the more comprehensive they are. They're more comprehensive today than they were in 2014, and they're more severe today than they were in 2014. And Japan has been a leader in this process today, and been not only a leader, they have been in lockstep with the United States and the other G7 countries in the EU.
Just jumping in on this sanction issue, today the ambassador of Russia announced some very, very strong and painful countermeasures, counter-sanctions. Do you have any idea of what they could be? Are you afraid of that?
No.
Okay.
That's one of the more clear questions with a clear answer that I've given all day.
Absolutely.
Maybe all in the last 4 weeks.
All right. The ladies there, who goes first?
Hello, Ilgin Yorulmaz, reporting freelance for BBC World Turkish. Thank you for coming here today. I'm also the second vice president. Well, I want to ask about the counter-sanctions issue and the economic collateral damage that comes to countries like Turkey, for example. It's a NATO ally and has the second largest army in NATO after the US, but it also has close ties with Russia, with Ukraine. Actually, we buy 70% of our gas from Russia and Ukraine. We sell military equipment, tourists, obviously, a source of income for Turkey from both Russia and Ukraine. My question is, who's going to pay for the bill for the collateral economic damage, as I call it, if these sanctions are met with counter-sanctions, or if there is a request from United States and Ukraine to form an anti-Putin alliance unanimously? Thank you.
Okay. Ambassador?
Well, I mean, I don't mean to use an old quote in the United States, but freedom is not free. The President has been clear from day one, as other leaders of European countries have been, that this will not be cost-free. Not only did he say on behalf that Russia would bear the price of this, but that he understood that there were consequences that would come home respectfully. I don't know what you want me to say to the question about Turkey. You're more familiar with it, but Turkey couldn't have been clearer where they thought that this aggression was wrong and they have been, if I'm not mistaken, selling drones to Ukraine because they understood the consequences of a decision like this.
Isabel?
Isabel Reynolds from Bloomberg. I just wanted to refer back to a comment made by your Ukrainian colleague earlier in the day. He expressed some hope that China, while it hasn't spoken against what Russia's doing at the moment, might not be in favor of violence and might be persuaded to somehow pressure Russia not to go too far. Do you think there's any hope on that front?
Well, I don't know. I wasn't here for what the Ukrainian ambassador said, and I'm not. And if there were things that he's wanting to point to from hope, I didn't hear that, so I don't want to comment. I do think President Biden earlier, when he talked about the stain of association, there are patterns and practices that are similar between Ukraine and Hong Kong. China had an agreement with the UK and Hong Kong. Russia has a Budapest 94 and a Minsk 2014 agreement. Both countries have violated what they signed on to. Both have reacted to country and their people who've expressed to be part of a system, of an international rules-based system, and both, through coercion and force, suppress that. If the ambassador to from Ukraine, or as Russia refers to it as a fictitious country, has other examples where China has spoken up or spoken out on behalf of dialogue and diplomacy, then they will have the right, through their actions, to show that they believe that, and the world will either see that or not. And the world is watching.
Khaldun.
What's his name? What did you say his name was?
His name is Khaldun, but he will
Khaldun.
introduce himself.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, for coming here. My name is Khaldun Azhari. I am correspondent of Arab News Japan, which is Saudi Arabia, and also Pan-Orient News, which is America. So my question is about Syria, because you mentioned Syria many times, and you said also many times it's a failed state. Japan follows the principles of not changing the status quo by the use of force and not annexing countries or territories after a military occupation. So this applied to Golan Heights. Japan rejected the annexation of Golan Heights by Israel. So what do you comment, what's your comment on this annexation by Israel? Do you think that warrant sanctions against Israel? Thank you.
Well, I'll make sure that the Israeli ambassador can come here and answer your question. I mean, I think the appropriate thing is, and I mentioned Syria for a very specific reason. The president of Syria has used chemical weapons on his own people. The people of Syria have protested on behalf of different freedoms and economic opportunities. The war in Syria has gone on, and it's a civil war. And the government of Syria, with its allies, both Russia and Iran, have bombed and killed the people of Syria. As it relates to the Golan Heights, as you know, the United States has spoken on that, and the international community has spoken about that.
Ambassador, we have still a few questions, and I ask you if you can stay 10 minutes more, take something, okay?
8, not 10. Yeah, that's
8.
fine.
Let's do it 11.
Yeah. Okay.
I'm
Yeah, that's
Italian.
good. There.
I'm Italian. I like to
8,
negotiate.
yeah, 8 and 10. We'll compromise on 11. Perfect.
All right. Okay. We have a question from.
You sound like one of my kids.
Well, I have a question from AFP, France Press.
Okay.
Sarah Hussein. President Biden has made it clear he will not commit troops to Ukraine, and sanctions have so far been unable to prevent an invasion and attack on Kyiv. What more can Washington bring to bear? What else is on the table, and what makes you believe these actions will be capable to preventing further Russian military advances?
Well, I think the question, if I may, it's not for me to say it's a wrong question. Let me try to rephrase it. The question, the president said beforehand there would be severe consequences. It was not about preventing. It was about changing. Yeah, well, you could say preventing, but the sanctions are about raising the cost of this action. And the difference between, let's say, the sanctions of 2014 around Crimea, as I noted, the Russian economy has shrunk by GDP by a third. Back then, it was Crimea. It wasn't the totality of Syria, Belarus, and now all of Ukraine, and the consequences. The costs of those burdens, of those countries, with a shrinking economy under the constant pressure of sanctions. Nobody thought they'd be about just preventing, but about raising the cost and the consequences.
Thank you. Today, we heard...
And let me say one other thing. It's a fair question to say, what about President Biden? But if I may, since he is my boss, give a shout out because I think it's worthy of noting. Unlike then, the world has acted in unison with a level of sanctions that the world never thought was possible. I think President Biden has marshaled both countries in Europe, countries in the Indo-Pacific, as noted by the comments of the Kenyan ambassador to the United Nations, countries in the African continent, who have spoken up about this and been in any way a part of a coalition that stands in contrast to the coercion exercised by President Putin. And so I think these sanctions will raise the ever-increasing costs on the Russian economy and the Russian government. And that's how they were designed to do.
Okay, we are approaching to the end, so let me ask you another off-topic but very important question.
This is a short 11 minutes. So go ahead.
Well, your staff is asking me to terminate you to...
I bet you they are asking you to
5.
terminate me. Don't worry.
So anyway, let's
I mean, the first time my staff didn't want to terminate me.
Let's get a couple of questions. This one I really think
Okay,
it's
go
an
ahead.
important one.
Sure.
My name is Danielle Dawra.
Danielle?
Dawra. D-A-W-R-A. I'm sorry, I don't know where she's from. And she's a co-founder of NGO Find My Parent.
Okay.
We're talking about kids.
Yeah.
As an organization that promotes the rights of children and families, we are gravely concerned about the invasion of Ukraine, of course, but at the same time, we are also concerned about the likes of 200,000 children who lose access to one parent each year in Japan, including children of Ukraine, Japanese American parents. These children living in a country not at war pay a heavy toll for Japan's antiquated family laws. This is all because, like Russia, Japan's commitment to international treaties is not worth more than the paper they are signed. So we ask you, what are you committed to do to protect our children in Japan who are at grave risk of being abducted by a parent or already have been abducted? Yeah. You know that even recently there have been many cases.
Yeah. Let me say this. I have an open door policy and would love the opportunity to talk to Daniela.
Yes.
About her concerns as it relates to children, abducted children, and the situations that surround them.
Right.
Okay, thank you.
We, okay, we have that, yeah, from there, and then will be the last question.
This is going to be the last question.
Huh?
Last question.
This is last? Okay, then I'll do it. You mentioned that...
It was so quick. I love you. I don't know what happened over there. It was a great question, no doubt.
One of my first assignment was the Yugoslavia war. And before you mentioned that NATO has only defense objectives. Well, to be sincere, it didn't look like defense war in Yugoslavia. So when we hear that Putin is the first one that starts a war in Europe after World War II, I personally have some doubts. What do you think about this?
Well, are you asking about the United States or you're asking about the war?
About the war that was staged by NATO and the United States against Serbia.
Well,
Against Yugoslavia.
well, I disagree with your question and your interpretation, having been in the Clinton White House and understanding what happened at the Dayton Accord. As Yugoslavia as a country, what that battle was about, and America used its military force as at that time to separate the countries, to separate them so that the genocide that was occurring there, as Croatia, Bosnia, Serbia, try to separate, and then Kosovo later on, to not allow Europe and the European continent to once again be stained by ethnic and religious genocide. One could argue that the association of Yugoslavia would never hold, but you could also argue the stain of genocide and genocide in the faith in the name of ethnic cleansing was a proper use of military force that ended up with an agreement that, for good and for bad, has basically held since the Dayton Accord. So I think your moral equivalence is totally wrong.
We disagree. Thank you very much. This is the honorary membership for the ambassador, so you're welcome to come and chat.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for having me.